You're listening to The Weather Junkies.
Oh boy. Large wedge tornado coming up into Tuscaloosa. A winter storm warning is in effect for our area.
Just so we can expect at least another 2 to 4 inches overnight. Then that snow.
The National Weather Service in Huntsville has issued a tornado warning for northwestern Massachusetts.
14 to 22 inches of snow!
Good evening and welcome to the Weather Junkies. We have an action-packed episode lined up for you. We're very excited for the lineup we have. It's Wednesday, December 9th. Hard to believe already December, and it's especially hard to believe here in the Northeast, where the weather has certainly not been December-like. We have no winter to be found, no winter in sight, actually, for the foreseeable future. Of course, I'm Tyler Jankowski, joining the show from Connecticut, alongside Dakota Smith, joining us from Colorado. Dakota.
Good evening, Tyler, and everyone listening to the show today. I'm Dakota, and I'm here out in Fort Collins, Colorado. It was a beautiful day out here. I went outside, jeans and a sweatshirt. I'm a bad meteorologist. It was 60-some degrees outside. Went back inside, put on the shorts, and didn't regret that decision at all. How's the weather out there on the East Coast?
Wow, 60 degrees. Did not know that's how warm it is in Colorado.
I'm from Chicago.
But, you know, oftentimes the weather where you are is our weather a few days later. And right now, temperatures are in the 40s. In fact, the overnight low tonight is higher than the average afternoon high. So we're in a crazy weather pattern with consistent above average temperatures, and it only gets crazier as we head into the weekend. In fact, temperatures are expected to be near 60 degrees both Saturday and Sunday, really even into Monday. There have been some indications maybe middle 60s are possible on Sunday, but given the time of year and the volatility of the weather pattern, we kind of pulled back our forecast to about 60 today, but that is outrageous. The average high this weekend is around 40 degrees, and we'll be some 20 degrees above that. And not only that, but I mean, obviously the overnight lows are nowhere close to where they should be. We don't have any snow in the forecast. It's a crazy weather pattern, certainly one that has the ski areas stressed out, I would imagine.
Thank you, global warming.
No, it's actually El Nino, I would say.
Yeah, no, I'm kidding. We all know that weather on a given day is no indication of global warming. Let's get into our first tweet of our Weather in the Twitterverse segment. The first tweet's from the National Weather Service in State College, and it was actually spurred by a fellow Penn Stater, Mike Spagnola. The tweet from the State College National Weather Service said, "We get this. Well, get this. I just found it," which is a freezing fog advisory, under rarely used products, so I can issue it now. Don't want to confuse now. This situation was really interesting. There's been a lot of fog in central Pennsylvania the past almost a week now, a few days, and they've had some freezing fog overnight, and they couldn't find the freezing fog advisory to issue. And that kind of concerns me from a National Weather Service standpoint. They can't issue advisories that they should be issuing just because they can't find it.
Hopefully Michael is listening. I wanted to correct his last name, Michael Spagnolo.
What did I say?
I think you said something else. I can't remember what it was. But this is a fascinating tweet, and I'm glad you brought it up because somehow I missed the entire conversation when it actually happened. I didn't miss the fog, though. I knew that there was – actually, I was away this weekend. That's exactly why I missed it. You know, the freezing fog that has occurred in the Northeast for days, not just once, but days on end here. And this is a fascinating exchange here on Twitter because you know, you see the National Weather Service coming out and basically talking on the same level as us weather fans and meteorologists, not hiding anything and basically saying, oops, we didn't know that we could actually issue this. But it also speaks to the problem of our warning system. We have so many warnings, so many, in fact, that the National Weather Service person issuing the warning doesn't even know that they can issue it or that it exists in their area, which I think is crazy. I laughed when I read that. But then you see a reply saying from Andy Moffat, I personally think both a freezing fog advisory and the generic dense fog advisory would be appropriate. I don't know if I agree with that, but I definitely agree that they should have issued the freezing fog advisory. One reason being, we know a lot about Central PA, Alpha Fire Company. One of their frontline engines was hit on the highway and suffered about $100,000 in damage because of the freezing fog, the icy conditions, the low visibility. So there were definitely impacts that you don't see with just dense fog. And so that's why I think this is a little bit of a screw up. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully they get any problem like that figured out at any weather forecasting office. It was nice, though, you're right, to see them interact with us on Twitter. On to our next tweet. This tweet is from Matt Lanza, who's an operational meteorologist, contributor to Space City Weather and 538. You can follow him at Matt Lanza. And his tweet says, updated for yesterday, Seattle continues to blow away rainfall in previous recorded strong El Nino events.
I love Twitter. You love Twitter. Most meteorologists love Twitter. And I think the reason is it's so easy to share information. Unfortunately for us, a ton of people aren't on Twitter. A ton of people, and by that I mean people that don't really study the weather. So even though it's very helpful for us to exchange information, it'd be kind of neat if Twitter had the same audience reach that Facebook does. But at least right now it doesn't. And his tweet is remarkable. It's a graph of, as you said, the rainfall in a year with a strong El Nino. The black line that you see is the current season that's in progress, and it's on pace to outpace all of the or out total the other years where there was a strong El Nino, the last one notably being 97, 98. And, we've been saying all along, when I say we, I mean meteorologists, that with a strong El Nino, you expect a lot of moisture in Northern California and perhaps the Pacific Northwest. Certainly some needed drought relief in areas that have been hit with an extreme drought out there. And, we've been classifying this El Nino as the strongest, if not the strongest, one of the strongest El Ninos ever recorded. And it's kind of nice to see one of the expected results kind of be in the top or lead the pack, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And this these precipitation amounts in the Pacific Northwest are from those atmospheric rivers. They've had a few of them come through, and that's what happens when you get a slew of moisture coming off the Pacific.
There's always some quabbling among scientists as to the official definition, but certainly there has been atmospheric rivers, at least one, contributing to the amount of rainfall out there. A lot of flooding footage coming in that I saw today. So that's a great tweet from Matt Lanza. We've been reading the bios in the past, so don't want to stop. He is an operational meteorologist in energy, weather, and he's a weather contributor for Space City, WX, and 538. He is a Rutgers alumnus. And our next tweet, time for the next tweet. This one is another fascinating one, a little bit central Pennsylvania heavy today. And the tweet is from the Penn State Campus Weather Service, and it says, moisture from a sewer treatment plant caused snow near the Nittany Mall last night. Of course, the content here originated from the National Weather Service and State College on Facebook, but for the purpose of promoting the Campus Weather Service account, we'll just stick here. And you see the map here. Basically, we're talking a few blocks, a few neighborhoods where this snow occurred. obviously, it was not in the forecast. You're talking about a span of a few blocks. And this is what the road looked like. It's quite impressive. Certainly for a forecaster in the area, the terminology would probably be a little bit different when this is occurring. But what were your thoughts when you saw this, Dakota?
The first thing I thought of was back in a Medio 201, freshman year with Dr. John Neese. And he told us a story or an event that happened. I forget the town, but it's in western Pennsylvania. And they had a nuclear facility was producing snow downwind. And that's the first thing I thought of. And the events like these are just, they're kind of mind-blowing in a way. How something so, when you think about it, these plants or sewer plants or power plants, they're small compared to our atmosphere, yet they can produce snow in a localized area.
Yeah, micro scale. And obviously Neese comes up a lot in our Weather Junkies podcast, rightfully so. I mean, he's a wealth of knowledge. You brought up the power plant snow north and west of Pittsburgh, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm familiar with it is he did a segment for Weather World, his WeatherWise segment on it, and I helped him with the segment, produce the graphics, and that was another case of this happening. A little bit larger scale, I would say. But the other thing that came to mind about this is there's a lot of young meteorologists out there, certainly us included, a lot of wannabe meteorologists on Twitter. And this, I think, teaches an important lesson. And that is, even when you're 95 or 99% sure that your forecast is going to pan out, sometimes it doesn't. And there is no way to see this coming. And this would be a case where, you know, you could be so confident that there's not going to be snow, and all of a sudden there's snow and the roads are slippery.
Yeah, the weather's the weather, and it's certainly one of the most unpredictable things that we deal with as humans. Our next tweet is from Cape Cod Weather. You can follow them at Cape Cod Weather. It's a meteorologist forecasting weather on Cape Cod and working in emergency management and disaster preparedness. And his tweet is, the first 9 cycles of the CFS show above normal warmth persisting through January. And that might be kind of a bummer for some of the snow lovers across the United States.
Cape Cod Weather on Twitter, a wealth of information. Great follow if you want Cape Cod Weather. I know of his tweets fairly well. I follow him on Twitter. And this tweet is interesting because it shows the climate forecast system. From what I gather, a bit of a polarizing weather model. Sometimes it can be totally wrong from what I gather, and sometimes it can be pretty much spot on. And in the last 1 or 2 months, October, November, and basically December, we're in it and it's occurring. The climate forecast system has forecast well above average temperatures. So the track record in this pattern the last couple of months has been very good. And for January, obviously this coming January, it's forecasting basically the same thing that's going on right now. So if I had to pick a side, I'd probably side with the CFS. I mean, that's how it looks for now. But again, there are times when the CFS is completely out to lunch and inaccurate, but certainly worth looking at. His tweet specifically was, first 9 cycles of the CFS show above normal warmth persisting through January. This would be devastating for ski areas in the Northeast. So you would assume that their hope is this does not happen.
It's kind of the narrative that you've kind of been talking about, that they're expecting lower than average snow in some of those areas in the Northeast. Let's get to our next tweet from, I would say, a meteorologist's best friend, and that's NASA. They provide a lot of, that's an understatement, a lot of weather data for forecasting. And the tweet is, the future of forecasting is scheduled to launch October 2016. Learn about the GOES-R satellite. And they have a link there, as well as some of the stats that GOES-R will be doing. And the thing that I thought was really interesting was the 30-second scans of severe weather events. I'm curious, Tyler, you picked this tweet. What was the reason for that?
I picked this tweet because we've heard rumblings about GOES-R for at least a couple of years now, and we're getting closer to it actually happening. And I think in forecasting and in meteorology, some things don't get the respect that they deserve, and the value is not recognized as much as it should be, and that is satellites. I mean, satellites don't just take a picture of the clouds nowadays. That was the 60s and the 70s. Nowadays, they do a whole lot of things, including, you know, not just weather forecasting, but fire and smoke monitoring, volcanic ash, and more. And so I think the thing that fascinates me about this next generation of satellites is just the frequency and the resolution of the images it'll produce. I see it says faster scans every 30 seconds of severe weather. I haven't read the in-depth specs, but I would assume that means a visible satellite picture, your typical cloud picture.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. A lot of us have probably seen the hurricane satellite pictures every minute, I believe, and they show a loop, you know, usually goes viral on Twitter or Facebook, and it's impressive. So I can only imagine what every 30 seconds would bring, and just a wealth of information. Obviously, we nowadays have more information than we're able to digest and use, but this is going to really revolutionize some of the things that we do. I think it'll help the models immensely.
Yeah, the NASA satellites continually revolutionize how we forecast, and this is definitely another potential candidate for that. I use a lot of remotely sensed data in my work, specifically something called fluorescence data, and that it's a long story short, it's basically just light that's emitted from plants that satellites can pick up, which is just incredible. So I believe that's our last tweet, and we can get into our main topic, which I am very excited for. Dr. David Titley, who is his resume is very, very long, and he was nice enough to join us tonight. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a few times while I was at Penn State, and he's just a great guy.
Yeah, he came on board at Penn State after both of us had started. So towards the end of our time at Penn State, he came on board. As you said, his career spans several decades. He has wealth of credentials to his name, and he spent many years actually as a rear admiral in the Navy. He was a naval officer for 32 years. So the bottom line, he has a wealth of knowledge, a lot of experience, and Penn State is really lucky to have him as a professor of practice in the Department of Meteorology. And of course, we both have busy lives, so we weren't able to do this interview live tonight, but Dakota, you recorded this actually earlier today. So it's same day, kind of like a DVR, same day. And we want to showcase the interview tonight that we recorded earlier. He, as we said, is a professor currently at Penn State, but he spent 32 years as the naval officer. And after retiring from the Navy, he actually was the chief operating officer of NOAA. He's also a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and serves on several advisory boards and National Academy of Science committees. So this week, you may have saw on Twitter or on Facebook, he was invited to Washington to testify before the Senate Subcommittee on Science, Space, and Competitiveness. Dakota caught up with him earlier today.
We'd like to welcome Rear Admiral Dr. David Titley to the show. Dr. Titley, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to be with us.
Well, thanks so much, Dakota, for having me.
How was, just a quick question, how was the weather down there?
We're in State College and Pennsylvania, and we have been having almost unprecedented freezing fog conditions. I think it's day 4 or day 5, and weak sunshine in December, stagnant air, no real movement in the synoptic pattern, and we're just having a heck of a time trying to lift this. So we tend to stay in the 30s and low 40s, and it reminds me, if any of your listeners have lived or live out in the Pacific Northwest, you sometimes get these real stagnant situations. That's what we've got over Pennsylvania right now.
Yeah, we've been following that, and we actually touched on it a little bit on the show. Some of the National Weather Service has to issue advisories that they've never issued before, and they actually had some issues getting those out. So definitely an interesting setup in Pennsylvania right now.
They're having, it's a real forecast challenge to figure out, because if this mixes out, you'll be in the mid 50s before you know it. But if it doesn't, you're in the mid 30s. So it's a real interesting, not only a forecasting for a hardcore meteorologist perspective, but how do you communicate that effectively to the public that, these are days in which you have so much greater uncertainty in your maximum temperature. So yeah, lots of interesting stuff, even if to most people I'll bet the weather looks boring, but to hardcore weather people, it's kind of interesting. Yeah,
it certainly has grabbed my attention. So I initially reached out to you to talk about some of the interactions between NOAA and Congressman Lamar Smith on the topic of that is a science paper that deals with the global warming hiatus. But I didn't realize that you were going to be in D.C. At a hearing in front of the chairman, Senator Ted Cruz, and I kind of wanted to start with that, because I listened to the hearing and I thought there were some really interesting parts of it that were certainly eye-opening for me. I wanted to start with the title of the hearing was Data or Dogma, Promoting Open Inquiry in the Debate Over the Magnitude of Human Impact on Earth's Climate. So I want to start off with what do you think, or what is your perception of the purpose of this hearing?
Well, I mean, irrespective of the title of the hearing, the purpose of the hearing, I believe, was to try to instill as much doubt and confusion into any member of the general public who might listen to this, as well as to basically show Senator Cruz's, true hardcore climate denying credentials to his base to, help him out in his presidential campaign.
Gotcha. And why did they bring you into it?
Well, the way the hearings work is the minority party, the Democrats in this case, you get at least one witness, as I understand Senate rules, sometimes more, but at least one. So, kind of a long story of how it ended up being me, but kind of the bottom line was it ended up being me. And I said yes. I'm not sure if that's always the smartest thing to do, but I said yes. And because I personally felt that somebody needed to be able to represent mainstream science, climate science, and let me say here, and I say every place I can, there are hundreds and probably thousands of more distinguished and capable mainstream climate scientists than myself. But I do bring a somewhat unique perspective in that I was also a two-star naval officer, and I started the Navy's Task Force on Climate Change. So I kind of live at this intersection of security, policy, and science. So I think that made me somewhat of an attractive witness. And from a personal standpoint, where I am in my career, it's not like I'm a young career scientist, and if I, make somebody upset, I'm, going to either be working at Walmart or eating stale bread crust with leftover peanut butter for the rest of my days. So, I'm in a fortunate position where I can kind of tell anybody, respectfully, but I can sort of tell anybody, including presidential candidates, that, if they're wrong, then they're wrong, and let the chips fall where they may.
So one of the more interesting parts of the hearing was when you and Senator Cruz got into an exchange about satellite data, and and I'd like to take a listen to that right now, just to give the listeners kind of an idea of what you were talking about.
Here was 1998, and here's today. So on me, I mean, I'm just a simple sailor, but it's hard for me to see the pause on that chart. So I think the pause is kind of coming.
Do you dispute the satellite measurement?
Let's not talk about the satellite. Here's
But
okay,
sir, I'm asking, do you dispute? I understand that the global warming alarmists don't want to talk about the satellite data, but I'm asking.
Satellite. Let's talk about the satellite measurements. Let's talk about orbital decay. Let's talk about overlapping satellite records. Let's talk about stratospheric temperature contamination. I think Dr. Christie and Dr. Spencer, when they've put this out, they have been wrong, I think, at least 4 consecutive times. Each time the data record has had to be adjusted upwards. There have been several sign errors.
So this came down to be a debate between a climate scientist and a non-scientist senator about climate science. What is that dynamic like for you?
Well, it's an interesting dynamic because you're the witness, and not only is this a senator, this is the chair of the committee. So this is not an equal power structure. I mean, this is not like 2 professors, at AMS in a coffee break kind of debating ideas. I mean, this is set up to be a very unequal power structure. So you got to remember that. And whatever anybody may or may not think of Senator Cruz's views on climate, you need to, remember, if before you get going down an exchange like that, he is, he's a very smart person. He has a degree in law from Princeton Law School. He clerked for a Supreme Court Justice, William Rehnquist. So, this is not a dummy. And he's probably as smarter than any faculty member you can pick out of just about any university. So those are 2 things you got to remember. But he is not a climate scientist, and he's not a physical scientist. He's a lawyer, and he's being given talking points, and he knows the point he wants to get to, and he knows what he wants you to say, but he doesn't know the science. So, it's a very interesting dynamic in that sense, and very, very different than sort of most of the time. Let's say if you're in a professional setting, let's say NOAA or NASA or a university or the National Science Foundation, it's a very different dynamic than that.
I thought compared to some of the other exchanges I've seen with him and some, I guess, witnesses, I thought it was it was very well done, and you addressed his point, because one of his bigger points was, the satellite data, they're not using it, or he kind of claims that it's perfect, and I haven't seen anyone actually challenge that opinion, and you went for it. So I commend you for that. That was a good.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's always, as all of us can do whenever you end up in one of these sort of exchanges or debates almost with anybody, kind of as you're, then in the car 2 hours later driving back home, you think of the perfect response. and I'm no different. I realize, sort of playing that back, that and the other thing in this dynamic that people probably don't always realize is, like, when Senator Cruz puts up a chart, that's the very first time I've seen that chart.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they've given you this stuff before, like homework, and says, okay, you're going to be asked to respond to Exhibit A. It's like you're seeing Exhibit A when people on that clip. That's when it is.
Yeah.
So you don't know really what the data are, let alone error bounds, all of the stuff that you would ask as a scientist. You don't know that. So, but one thing I guess I figured out sort of later, or somebody told me, is the satellite observations were attempting to reconstruct a mean temperature, an average temperature between 0 to 50,000 feet. So if you think about it, and this is what I figured out, after, of course, 50,000 feet is not mid-tropospheric. I mean, this is, you're up into the stratosphere now. And again, we know by well-established theory that not only do we have, while the temperatures are warming near the surface where the atmosphere is, they're actually cooling, right, in the stratosphere. So if, what I also should have talked about was, the fact that if, I think the senator or maybe Dr. Christie said mid-tropospheric, and I should have pointed out that the 500 millibar level is at about 18,000 feet. Yet the satellite measurements, according to their own chart, go up to 50,000 feet. So we would expect this satellite, if it's assuming it's calibrated correctly and assume all the complicated radiative transfer equations have been done right, but you would expect it to pick up both the warming signal of the troposphere, but also the cooling signal. So, in the simplest cases, if you average +1 and -1 together, you get 0.
Yeah.
And I think that would have been effective, but of course, as I said, I thought of that about 2 hours too late.
Well, I knew that chart was misleading, but I had no idea it was that misleading.
I think, again, I would have to go back and look at that, but a couple people told me this was 0 to 50,000 feet. So again, everybody, we all learned in our, very first meteorology course, there's the 500 millibar level.
Yeah.
There's, by definition, the middle by depth, right, by volume. By mass of the atmosphere is at 18,000 feet. So yeah, you guys are measuring at 50,000 feet. You're not mid-troposphere, that's for sure. But as I said, this is all things you play back in your head. So no matter how much you prepare, and I had watched Senator Cruz's exchange with, I believe it was the Chief Executive Officer of the Sierra Club. It's a clip that's pretty widely available.
Yeah.
Aaron Mayer, M-A-I-R. And unfortunately, Mr. Mayer was not, Mr. Mayer's staff probably did not adequately prepare him to be a witness in front of Senator Cruz on a climate topic. And as painful as that clip is to watch, it's very instructive. So, for anybody who is ever in this position, this is, no matter how well you do, this stuff, it's really good to do your homework and practice. I did that, but, no matter how much you do, you always can sort of replay it and realize where maybe next time you can even do better.
Right. I wanted to move on to the initial testimonies from Dr. John Christie and Dr. Judith Curry. Those two testimonies particularly were eye-opening to me, and I learned something from how they view climate change. I wanted to summarize one of their themes that I kind of discovered was that climate models are not reliable and shouldn't be used for policy. I work with climate models as a grad student here at Colorado State, and I well know that climate models are not perfect. As you said in your testimony, all models are wrong, some are useful, but they're our best representation of future climate, and as scientists, we want to continue to improve them so we have a better picture on what our future climate is going to be. So what's kind of your take on that theme or that idea from them?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned there is, Dakota, is exactly right. I mean, nobody claims the models are perfect. I don't know that there is such a thing as a perfect model. I guess, if it was a perfect model, you would be modeling, I don't know, every turbulent eddy, you think about it and it just becomes absurd, of course, right? I mean, there's not computing power. Models by definition fill in the gaps in space and time in our observations, and they are simplifications of reality. That's almost the definition of a model. So what, when people say that, I think they're really ignoring, frankly, decades of not perfect, but useful climate model projections. And, you know, I think, I can't remember if I mentioned the Hansen models back in 1979, 1980. I can't remember if I was able to bring that up in the hearing or not. But, you know, Hansen's model, you know, run on, I think I must have mentioned this, you know, it was run on, you know, basically less computing power than probably everybody has in their pocket in their smartphone now.
Yeah.
You know, really did pretty good for, well, now we've been able to verify for 35 years with real, you know, post-run verification temperature data. And it's not bad. It was, if anything, Hansen was a little conservative. He was a little too cold on his model. I'm sure you could find other models that were too warm. But it sure showed that we were going to start going up. And obviously, you know, given, you know, the intrinsic variance of the internal and natural variability, it does. But, you know, so I would respectfully disagree strongly with Drs. Christie and Curry that we cannot use the models for policy. They're not perfect, but they're what we have. But more importantly, we do know that in large measure, on large scales, they're pretty good. It's why I, you know, related it to the intelligence community. We make lots of decisions on what our intelligence community can tell the United States in the security realm. The intelligence professionals we have, they're tremendously dedicated, very hardworking individuals, men and women. But you know, you look at their projections when you start getting out decades, and they're not always great. But we still make, you know, we understand that, and it's hard. But we still make decisions. I mean, there's the climate guys, the climate community is telling our nation's leadership much more than the intelligence community can possibly tell them about what the world 50, 60, 70 years from now is going to look like.
Right.
And it's just, well, it's kind of a tragedy that we, in fact, are still spending our time debating whether we should even consider these models, to even consider them in policy decisions.
Some of another kind of one of the themes is we don't know how climate change is going to impact the weather phenomena in particular. And while I agree we don't you know, have a complete grasp on that because weather is hard to predict, I think we do have high certainty on some of the more large scale things, particularly the impacts on the ocean, including ocean acidification and how that will impact marine ecosystems, and also the thermal expansion of the top layer of our oceans, and how that will impact sea level. So I think we have the knowledge to act on a few of these impacts that we have higher certainty on.
Yeah, I would say on the ocean acidification, I think we have actually very high certainty on how that chemistry is going to change. I might disagree with you slightly on if we understand the impacts. I think though most oceanographers and biological oceanographers I talk to understand it's a tremendous risk because we really don't understand what the impact is going to be. So there was just a segue for a second. Earlier this year, I, along with Dr. Shirley Pomponi, co-chaired a National Academies of Science Committee study on what we call decadal survey on ocean sciences. And it did a number of things, but one of the things we did is listed 8 priority focuses for research in oceanography. And of course, climate, the impacts of climate is in there, but one of them was food webs. And something I learned from serving on this committee was that our biological colleagues really don't understand fully how marine food webs work. So we don't already understand the baseline, and now we are changing the chemistry of the ocean. We are acidifying the ocean at a rate, you know, in the last 200 years, it's been more than the last tens of thousands of years. So we have injected this big stress into those ocean ecosystems. And, you know, maybe it'll be okay. But, you know, this is now where hope is a strategy, and hope is usually a bad strategy. And it could be really bad. We don't know, but it's a massive risk we've undertaken here.
And that is part of the interview with Dr. David Titley that Dakota conducted earlier today. He was talking about some of his thoughts on climate change, and certainly the recent sparring that went on in Washington between a number of people, but especially with Ted Cruz. And the conversation went on because, that aside, there has been an ongoing issue between NOAA and its leadership and a representative from Texas. And this has been going on for many months between NOAA and Congressman Lamar Smith. It started back in June, and that's when a NOAA scientist by the name of Dr. Thomas Carl and a few others published a paper in Science that corrected surface temperature data. Of course, the correction basically got rid of what was called a hiatus in global warming by some. And when that happened, it caused an uproar by some, one being House Representative Lamar Smith, the chairman of the Committee on Space, Science, and Technology. So he wrote a letter to Catherine Sullivan, and she is the administrator of NOAA, demanding all documents, all communications, including emails that led to the team's discovery, be released, or at least him be able to see them. Basically, the team that corrected the surface temperature trend over the last decade or so. And there's been a strong response from a number of organizations. NOAA, the AMS, AGU responded with pushback in a stance to protect the academic freedom of scientists. And Dakota, would you like to add anything before we get into the next part of our interview with Dr. David Titley? Dakota will add some to the discussion.
Yeah. So I guess the first part of that, just to give people a little more background, they kind of stacked the deck against Dr. Titley. They had 4 climate skeptics as witnesses, and then Dr. David Titley, who represents the majority of scientists when it comes to climate change. And it's kind of interesting, right? They have 4 climate skeptics, one climate scientist who, it has the mainstream attitude, but he's in the minority at the hearing. So I thought he did a great job, and he's a very good speaker and really knows his stuff. So I'd like to get into the next segment about NOAA and Congress.
Yeah, let's listen into Dr. Titley's perspective on the situation between the feud between Congressman Lamar Smith and the NOAA administrator Sullivan.
So I wanted to change direction here for a second. Near the end of Cruz's hearing, he talked about doing signs of academic freedom, and he read a letter from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Let's listen to that now.
The minority has submitted into the record is a letter from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. A sentence within that letter: we are committed to the principle that scientific inquiry and open scientific communication, regardless of field of study, should proceed unhampered by intrusions on academic freedom. Now, that is a noble sounding statement, and one that with which I agree emphatically.
So Senator Cruz brings up a good point here. Good science is done when there is freedom to do the science right. He might not be coming from a standpoint that I agree with. The reason that he's saying this might not be what I agree with, but it's a good point, and that brings us to the current situation involving NOAA and Congressman Lamar Smith. So, Dr. Titley, what impact do you think the back and forth between NOAA and Congressman Smith, or the result of this, what maybe do you think this could have an impact on future science, particularly if the scrutiny or inquiry from government officials becomes the normal?
It's an interesting question, and it's a pretty disturbing trend. And we've seen it a little bit on both sides, although honestly, I think we've seen it more from kind of the right of center, but it's not exclusive to the right of center.
Mm-hmm.
There is an increasing emphasis on totally showing the money, and even if it's appropriate, they want to see that. But now we're seeing with Congressman Smith, kind of a new twist on this, and you almost wonder if he was trying to create a Climate Gate 2015 right ahead of the Paris talk.
Yeah.
The timing is certainly interesting. In the sense that you can do a few things, even if you don't show anything like Climate Gate, but you can get an effect like Climate Gate before Copenhagen had, of in the public's mind, you sow doubt as to the integrity of maybe science in general, but climate science in particular. So you're trying to, without saying so, but you're trying to basically cast aspersions, if you will, over the entire science enterprise involved in climate. And, since one of the strategic objectives is, not to have a policy discussion or change policies, by simply being able to sort of, really sort of, challenge the credibility in general of the science and say, well, yeah, I know what these guys show, but we know we can't really trust anything. So therefore, we shouldn't pay attention to it. That way, you don't have to even refute study by study. You can just say, well, the whole thing, I don't believe it. So I think there may be a strategic objective there. I think there might be a tactical objective as well, is to just, make climate science less appealing a field to work in. If you have sort of this fear that you're going to be hauled up in front of a congressional committee and subpoenaed, and having just been at a congressional committee yesterday, it's not the most pleasant experience in the world. And you go, why would you want to do this if you can work on something else where the chances of this happening are very, very slim? So I think there is a real chilling effect. So it's somewhat ironic that Senator Cruz talks about kind of academic freedom and we should, pursue the truth wherever the data lead us. I think that's what Dr. Tom Carl and his colleagues have done. The paper was published in Science. It was peer-reviewed very thoroughly. It actually, contrary to Congressman Smith's assertions that the paper was rushed into publication, when you look at the actual dates, the paper took longer than the average science paper to go from submission through the review process, adjudication, and ultimate publication. It was very thoroughly looked at. Does that mean it's correct? Not necessarily. That's not what peer review means. But we do know that it was looked at very carefully for methodology, for bias, and the reviewers and ultimately the editors believe this paper meets the high standards of the Journal of Science. And
that part right there, that's when the good skepticism in science would come into play. You mentioned in your testimony that skepticism is good in science, and I feel like that's where the skepticism would have happened. That would have kind of promoted the science. It's
vital in science. I mean, if we all just sort of believed everything we had read in our third grade textbooks, we would never advance science. I mean, science is just really, Senator Cruz said yesterday, it's like come up with a hypothesis, test it, and you're done. And that's sort of, kind of what we learn in 6th or 7th grade, what science is. But science, and I wrote about this in my written testimony. I guess that's where I would write, right, in the written testimony. Mm-hmm. But science is this very exciting enterprise. It's this interplay and interaction between society needs, between really data and discovery and, that aha moment that we sometimes get in the middle of the night that we've thought of an idea. But ultimately, science comes down to testing and evidence. Can you test your hypothesis? Do you have evidence? Can it be replicated? Does that evidence stand up, if you take a different data set? And then science, moves not on any one paper, but on the cumulative weight. So let's take a look at, two things. One would be, say, Dr. Christie's work with the temperature retrievals. And it turns out that, it was really quite, an interesting finding when he published this in the 90s and his assertion that the satellite data were showing the atmosphere was cooling. And that, it's a big assertion, so it got a lot of people interested. And as they were interested, they were not able to replicate Dr. Christie and Dr. Spencer's findings. And then they found out why. They had not accounted for orbital decay, stratospheric contamination, the continuity of different satellite records. A lot of technical details have in fact not been done correctly. Contrast that, let's say, with Dr. Michael Mann's hockey stick. Again, that was a very big deal when it came out, rightfully attracted a lot of scientific scrutiny. But now we're to the point where we have had dozens of groups of researchers replicate with independent methods the same finding, including the National Academies of Studies actually did an entire study on the hockey stick, and they came up with the same answer. So that piece of science looks pretty solid. The temperature retrievals from satellites, we realized, okay, initially we made a good try, but we didn't get it right the first time. It looks like Dr. Mann and the hockey stick came pretty close to getting it right the first time. But we didn't know either of those when either of those papers were published, and it was only subsequent science that allowed us to confirm one finding and modify another.
All right, that was part 2 of our interview with Dr. David Titley. Interesting thing I thought he brought up was the motivation for the elected official challenging the paper that basically eliminated the so-called hiatus in global warming. And I was glad that he brought it up because that's something I've been thinking about for a while. Why have this long, drawn-out fight? Why do you keep going back and forth, back and forth? What is the objective? What is the goal? And I think Titley hit the nail on the head, and that is, it's just a nasty dogfight to make it less desirable to either study climate science or speak about your opinion or help support the goals of the people that want to help the planet or reduce CO2 emissions. It just overall make it a tougher situation for really no other better reason.
Yeah, the motivation is definitely something to question. And it's interesting, I think that Dr. Titley kind of hit on this. It's interesting that, Cruz in this hearing is advocating for academic freedom when it comes to science, yet someone in his own party is scrutinizing, sorry, I hate that word. Scrutinizing. It's not even a criticism. They want all the guts behind the research, and if you understand how research works and how publications works, you can get all that just by reading the paper that in science and reading the papers that are referenced in that paper. And it's not the easiest thing to do, but that's how science is set up. The methods they use are methods that other people have used, and it's kind of, if he were a scientist, he would know that he could go back and look at all these references and realize what they're actually doing. And I wanted to bring up another point. I went to many faculty, some here at CSU, some at other places, and I couldn't get anyone to come on the record to talk about this until I messaged Dr. Titley. And I I think it's because a lot of these people get money from the National Science Foundation and even NOAA, and they don't want to take that risk. So it was very nice of Dr. David Titley to come on our podcast to speak on the record, especially right after his hearing. And we have one more bit of the interview that we did earlier today. And Tyler, did you want to give us a little intro for that?
Yes, of course, we touched on this a little bit before we got started, but of course, we want to let our guest finish out the show and talk a little bit about himself and really some advice he would provide to those listening or those that'll watch the show. Let's take it away.
So currently you're a professor of meteorology at Penn State and the founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather Risk and Climate Risk. For those of you listening, their website is solutions2, as in the number, and then wxrisk.tsu.edu. So I've read your About Us section online, but I was wondering in your words, what is the mission of your center?
Yeah, so really what we're trying to do is how do we use today's available weather and climate data to make the best risk decisions that we can. One of the things I'm interested in is, when I started back in the dark days, we had a couple of model runs, none of which were very good, teletype observations, really 1950s vintage radar that was hard to see, and weather balloons. And there wasn't much more. And looking out the sky, single station forecasting. Nowadays, you think of all the data that we have, sit down at your computer, look at your phone, ensembles, multiple model runs, the HER, all the way to the climate forecast system and everything in between. And that doesn't even get to the UK Met or the Europeans or the Canadians or the military. You can keep on going and going, and there is so much data. Everybody has access to level 3 radar data, so on and so on. How do we really use all this stuff? How do we optimize it? We have, I say on my Twitter page, I'm a recovering weather forecaster. I don't get to do too many forecasts anymore. But, we all have our rules of thumb. If the model's a lot of run-to-run variability, we probably weight it less. If it's, if the model had a dropout recently, we might not trust it as much. And we do these because, you're forecasters, and at, 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning, you better have that forecast done. So you got to do something. But are these the right rules? Are these the right rules today? How do we use all this? How do we then combine it with things like operations, with finance? How do we manage the risk? So you can think of, let's say, risks. Some of them you can manage with better operations. If you're, let's say, running a ski resort, if I really know, let's say, yes, I'm going to be below 32 for a couple nights, but I know I've got a week of warm-up, maybe I don't spend the energy to go make snow for 2 nights because I know it's going to be melted in like 5 days.
Right.
But let's say conversely, or the same ski operator, but now I'm looking at seasonal forecasts, or if, let's say, I was in California last year, and it's just very warm and very dry. So now no matter how good my operations are, it's not going to help me, right? So maybe I need to have a snow, I buy a hedge on a snow index, or I buy insurance at the beginning of the season, measured on if I get less than X inches of snow between, December and March, then you will pay me Y dollars. And that moves that risk of a hot, dry winter kind of off my books. And I know, okay, I'm not going to go bankrupt. Probably don't make as much money as I would if it had been a great season. Mm-hmm. So how do you combine those, how do you manage risks both operationally and through financial instruments? And really stop thinking of weather as, well, weather just happens and, that's what it is. And sometimes we know and sometimes we don't, to, hey, there are opportunities and there are risks. And how do I exploit the opportunities and how do I minimize those risks? So those are the kinds of things that kind of interest us in this.
Yeah, I think the purpose of your center is certainly one of the areas that's hottest in our field right now. And I look forward to the work that you guys do. And finally, you've you were a naval officer for over 30 years and achieved the rank of Rear Admiral. You were the Chief Operating Officer of NOAA, and now you're a researcher at Penn State and a faculty. I'm curious, what have you found to be the most important skill to have throughout your career?
There's a number. I'm not sure I can give you the most important. One skill that's really good to have, and it's sometimes hard to develop, is the ability to listen. Listen to mentors, listen to juniors, listen to your peers. Make your own decision, but listen. Don't go into things with a closed mind. I said yes to just about every kind of strange and weird opportunity that came up, and I can only think of about one time in 15 that I've regretted that. And even then I had kind of plan B, so it worked out okay. I would say, the learning has to keep continuing. The technology in our field, and really just about every field, just changes so quickly that you have to have some way of keeping yourself abreast of what's going on. And really, lastly, I would say is find that thing that you enjoy. It may not be right now, but kind of have a plan to get to something you enjoy, because, if you're going to go to work, you might as well have fun. So that's what I get to do right now at Penn State. Probably I get to do a lot of stuff up here, but one of the things that I enjoy most is actually working with the students. It's actually kind of strange for me, because in this job, I'm like, my office is one floor below where I spent almost half of my undergraduate time way back when. And, but it's sort of fun working with, the next, or maybe even two generations separated from that, the students who, you kind of remember back when you were that junior, that sophomore, that senior, wondering, so what is the world going to be like?
Yeah.
And trying to help. I think the students today, they get to learn so much more. Penn State's sending nearly 40 students to AMS this coming January. It's super. I think when I was here as an undergrad, I can't think of one undergrad who went to AMS. We didn't know what AMS was. We didn't know what the national academies were. Weather Enterprise hadn't even been invented. And I know at Penn State, our students know what this stuff is, and I'm sure that's true at many other institutions. So I think in general, we are doing a much better job of preparing the students. And it's really fun and an honor, frankly, to just be a small part of that.
Well, Rear Admiral David Titley, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and we look forward to talking with you again.
Okay, thanks, Dakota. I really appreciate it.
Again, big thanks to David Titley for coming on the show. Really, in the short amount of time we've been doing this show, he is probably one of the biggest gets, or so-called gets, that we've had so far. Not to knock on any of the previous guests, but we're really thankful that he was able to come on the show, especially so close to his trip to Washington to talk and stand up for science. And we had a little bit of an extra long show tonight, over an hour. And again, thanks to Dr. Titley for coming on. Dakota, any final words from you?
Yeah, so if you want to check out the actual hearing, the full hearing's on YouTube, and the link is in our description. And any of the content that we featured on here, any of the tweets are in our description, wherever you view the show. And speaking of which, you can view the show or listen to the show on SoundCloud or iTunes, and view the show on YouTube. If you're listening live right now, thank you very much. We really appreciate you guys joining us. Follow us on Twitter at The Weather Junkies, at the WX Junkies, and on Facebook. We're not exactly sure we're going to talk about next week, but
feel free to submit ideas.
Yeah, in the short time we've done this show, I've realized that there is so much to talk about when it comes to weather, and it's hard to condense it all in the 45 minutes or an hour that we try to keep this show at.
So until next week, that is all we have for tonight. Thank you for listening, and we'll be right back here in 1 week.